Welcome to our posts. Today we will see stories of our Am I the Butthole? Am I the butthole for canceling the plans for Thanksgiving after my parents called my brother's baby their first grandchild? I am 32-year-old woman, have been with my wife Ava, 34-year-old, for 8 years now, but we've been married for 5. She was a single mom of 3 kids when we started dating. She had 2 daughters, now 10 and 12, and a son, now 16. I've watched these kids grow up. I've read the bedtime stories, done bath time, the first days of school, parent-teacher association meetings, all of it. I very much consider them to be my kids, and they've been calling me mom for almost 6 years now. My brother Ivan, 28-year-old, just had a baby girl with his fiancée Sarah, 27-year-old. I love my niece, and my kids adore their cousin. My kids have been the only grandchildren on my side of the family since Ava and I got together, and there's never been a moment where the kids and my wife were treated like they didn't belong. My brother is their uncle, my mom and dad are their nana and pop. The kids see my family as their family, and I always thought that my family felt the same way about them. The kids and I were over at my brother's house just hanging out, and my parents ended up dropping by with gifts for my niece. Ivan laughed when he saw the toys and told our mom and dad that they were going to end up spoiling her rotten. My mom said since my niece is their first grandchild, of course they have to spoil her. My kids were sitting in the living room with all of us, and my youngest daughter looked hurt when she realized what my mother said. My son and my 12-year-old didn't fully react to it, but I could tell it bothered the both of them too. Sarah spoke up and said, "Oh, you mean first grandbaby, not first grandchild." My dad shook his head and replied that my niece was their first grandchild. I didn't want my kids to keep sitting there and listening to that, so I handed my son my keys and told him to wait in the car with his sisters. When they were gone, I asked my parents why the hell they'd say that my kids weren't their grandchildren, and my mom said they couldn't be their grandchildren because they weren't really my children. My wife and I were going to be hosting Thanksgiving at our house this year, but I told my parents that if they didn't view my kids as their family, then they could just host a meal at their own house with their real family while I spent the holiday with mine. I left before they could say anything else to me, and my wife and I have reiterated to the children that they will always be my kids and I will always be their other mom, regardless of our DNA. My brother is pissed at me now because he thinks I reacted too harshly, and that I should try to see where my parents are coming from. My mom texted saying that she and my dad love the kids, but they still aren't their grandchildren, and she hopes that we can come to understand that because she doesn't want this to ruin my niece's first Thanksgiving. I haven't replied back. I meant what I said, but I'm worried that maybe I'm reacting too harshly. Next story. Am I the butthole for refusing to help my stepsister with her house purchase and telling her and my stepfather that it's because of how they treated me as a child? I'm 29-year-old woman. When I was about 10, my mom married my stepfather. I have an older brother, Luke, who was 15. My stepfather had Amy and Ada, who were 12 and 11. We didn't come from a privileged background. My mom was a minute wage worker and my dad was absent. Our stepfather had a very good income. Their deal was that they wouldn't combine finances, and they would each contribute equally to the household, and then each takes care of their children with their spare money. So my mom never had anything for us, and my stepfather was spending big on his kids. This included holidays which Luke and I were excluded from. Stepfather would pay for mom, but not us. Luke and I also shared a room even though Amy and Ada had their own rooms and we had a guest room, because stepfather insisted that he was paying more towards the house, so my mom's share would only get her one room for the kids. Luke and I were constantly teased for this situation by the 3 of them as we grew up. My mom always said that we should be thankful because if it wasn't for our stepfather we would not be living in a nice home in a good neighborhood. Anyway, Luke and I became determined to be able to take care of ourselves so that we wouldn't need to take nonsense from anyone. We have both done quite well with our careers and finances, and we are in a very good place. Since turning 18 and moving out, my relationship with the 3 of them has been very limited. I wouldn't call us friends, but we can exist peacefully if we are in the same place. I visited my mom recently and my stepfather mentioned that Amy wants to buy a house now that she's pregnant. He asked me if I'm able to help out a little with the deposit. The house is £500,000 and she needs a £150,000 deposit. She has £100,000 so far. £25,000 on her own, £25,000 from her mom and £50,000 from stepfather. He was asking if Luke and I can help cover the extra £50,000, and he said he'd pay us back as part of the inheritance eventually. I said no. He insisted that Luke and I both own our houses outright and with our incomes, so we should be able to help. I said whether I can or not is irrelevant, my answer is no. He reminded me that Luke and I each gave £10,000 to our cousin for buying a house as a gift. Amy is my sister and he's offering to pay us back. I said that was our choice then, this is my choice now. He insisted that we should be willing to help out our family if we're able to. I replied back, like how you helped me and Luke when we were kids? Everyone just went quiet when I said this. After a while, he said if we went back in time he'd have done things differently, treated all four of us equally. I said that's good of you, but doesn't make you entitled to my money now. He said he knows he's not entitled, that's why he's asking and promising to pay it back. I said the answer still is no, not entitled to a loan either. My mom later told me I could have turned him down without being in butthole or bringing up childhood, which he already feels guilty about. Am I the butthole? Next story. Am I the butthole for calling my wife unreasonable for backing out of spending Christmas with my family after my mother rejected her cookie sample? Context: for every holiday, my mother would ask the women in the family, my sisters, sister-in-law, my wife, my female cousins, to send samples of the desserts they plan to bring to the celebration for testing and to see if these desserts could make it to the food menu. My wife has been complaining about my mother deliberately rejecting every dessert sample she sent. So many times my mother has told her that she's being honest and keeping the guests' best interest at heart. Yet my wife still thought that my mother is deliberately excluding her since 2 of her dessert samples were rejected before. For this year's Christmas my mother is doing the same thing, but this time, she told every woman who are participating to make a cookie sample and send it to her for testing. My wife took it as a challenge, and to be honest she worked really hard to make a good sample and sent it to my mother days ago, and the results just came in yesterday. I came home from work and found my wife upset. I asked what's wrong and she told me that my mother rejected the sample she sent and decided to exclude her baking from the food list/menu for Christmas this year. I didn't know what to say, but she then told me she was backing out of the invitation to attend Christmas with my family. I was stunned when I heard her make this statement. I tried to talk to her, but she said it was done. I called her unreasonable to decide to bail on the whole family over some cookie sample. That's just freaking crazy and quite unreasonable. We had a full-on argument about it and she stated that my mother caused this, but I told her that my mother is pretty serious and careful about the food she offers to the guests since we are going to have relatives coming from all sides of country. She told me to stop mentioning it. Later I heard her cry despite telling her that her baking is amazing and people have preferences, that's all. Am I the butthole for insisting that her decision was unreasonable? Next story. Am I the butthole for telling my mom she only has one kid? My parents divorced when my sister and I were 5 and 6-year-old, now my sister 20 and I am 19. She met her husband 3 years later. He was a widower with a 7-month-old son. I think he was 7 months old when they met. She instantly moved them in and started claiming his son as her own and raising him like us. She got engaged to him, and a few weeks before the wedding our dad died. By this point my mom had just become estranged from her entire extended family. She told my dad's parents that if they wanted to see us again soon, they would need to come to her wedding and watch all 3 of us, including my stepbrother. She then told them after the wedding that going forward, if they wanted to see us or spend time with us, they had to include him. They hadn't wanted to. They tried to argue for time with just us, offering to pay for it all 100%. But Mom said no. She said they needed to come to the house and make an effort with all 3 and not just take 2 with them. My sister and I would argue with Mom over one day in particular. My dad's birthday. We celebrated that every year with Dad's family after he died, but she wouldn't even let that day be just us and them. Our stepbrother had to be there. She said they did not get to be just our family and we shouldn't see him as any less deserving of being present. But we did. He was not our dad's kid and had never met him. So why was he deserving of being there? I never got that. She called us selfish for the mindset. Last year I turned 18 and I moved in with my girlfriend. Once I left home, my stepbrother was no longer invited to anything to do with my dad's family. He no longer saw them. My sister and I also stopped spending any time at Mom's house. Then we stopped speaking to them at all. It was quiet for several months, and then last week Mom showed up where I work and demanded we talk. She told me how she was tired of one of her kids being left out and how sick was it to discard him that way, and why weren't my sister and I advocating for him. I told her she only had one kid, her stepson, and that my sister and I were no longer her kids and my family were no longer forced to include him to see us, and that it was all her fault for forcing it in the first place. Then I wished her luck, which was kinda sarcastic, not gonna lie, and then asked her to leave. She texted me later that night to say she had been a good mom to all three of us and to say she only had one kid was low. Am I the butthole? I hope you guys like this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share and subscribe the channel or posts.